Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Very nice to be with you again. My name is Cameron English, and I'm joined, as I usually am, by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. And we also have a special guest. She's been with us before. Susan Goldhaber is our resident toxicologist and just an all-around nice young lady. Susan, how are you this wonderful day?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me on, Cameron.
Hey, my pleasure. Chuck, as always, how are you? Nice to see you.
I'm fine. Unfortunately, the weather has taken a dip towards the cold, and I am a very fragile orchid. I am not liking this.
I don't think I've ever heard someone call themselves a fragile orchid, but I'm impressed. It's very, very colorful language. So we've got two stories we're going to talk about today. Susan's the author of the first one. Chuck took on the second one, which is about the health benefits of swearing, which I'm surprised people study, but there you have it. So first up is Susan's story. It's called Heavy Metal Tainted in quotes Baby Food. Oh, excuse me. I'm looking at the wrong story. I am all disheveled. I'm all disheveled, folks. Okay, the story is actually called Autism and Baby Foods. And Susan, why don't you give us the introduction here? We're talking about trial lawyers.
Right. Yeah, we're talking about court cases again. Basically, class action and lawsuits. And this is a true story. How I came about this was I was just driving one day and listening to the radio, and I heard an ad saying, "Does your child have autism?" It was a law firm. Call us now. You can win whatever, big money, because they figured out we know what causes autism. It's because if your child had eaten baby food when they were young, that's the cause. And of course, I almost drove off the road because I'm like, that's not the cause. We don't know the cause. But anyway, that's what got me looking to see what these lawsuits were about. I know there's a lot of junk science out there, but there had to be some basis, I thought, for how these were coming up and that they were soliciting clients. So that's where it started. And just to continue on, so basically when I looked into it, and it basically came from a few articles that looked back. There was one in 2019 from Consumer Reports, and there was also from 2021, the one that caused even bigger stir because it was from the House of Representatives. It was a government report where they had found some high levels. They did some random testing of baby foods. And this consisted of all kinds. The thing that some people were shocked at, organic, the ones that were natural, the more traditional, whatever. They had found, I don't know what percentage, but they found some high levels of arsenic and lead are the two. They looked at other compounds, but those are the ones that got the most attention. And so they had these articles, they had all these hearings about this. There was a big, and because they brought up the FDA officials asking how that can happen, how can they be in there, and the FDA basically said, well, they don't have standards specifically for baby food. They do have standards for different components in food, but they don't have it, and they work with the industry to make sure the levels are low, and they were going to try to do some more work. Basically, they put out some action levels on these two chemicals. But that's not the end of the story, because how do we get to these lawsuits? So the lawsuits didn't just say, oh, we found it. They said this causes autism. So when I tried to look up that, because I know I had investigated this about 5 years ago and I didn't see much evidence at all. It's a very hot topic, as you may, anybody who's a mother, wants to know and has a child with autism or any other type of, I won't use the words disease, I'll say disorder. In fact, I'll call it ASD, autism spectrum disorder, because that's more correct. But basically, so I went and looked at the science behind it. And so what kind of studies can you do to show if arsenic or lead cause ASD? Well, you can't, there's no direct way to find that out. But the closest thing that scientists do is to look for if there is an association. And how they do that is they look in hair, blood, or urine, they can look and see, they can measure levels of metals. And so in these studies, there's been a number of them, up to maybe like 50 studies where they took two groups. They divided a group, imagine children who had been diagnosed with ASD, children who had not. And then they took samples, pretty simple, of their blood, urine, and hair, and they looked for levels of arsenic and lead. And then they came out at the end and said, okay, is there statistically significantly higher levels of arsenic, we'll say arsenic, in the children who have ASD compared to the ones who don't? And if there is, now again, they're always misinterpreted. It doesn't mean that the arsenic caused the ASD, but they say that there's an association. So that's what these studies did. So I looked at a review. It's always better to look at a review because there's been, like I said, 50 studies done. And if you look at each one, so I looked at someone who did that. And there was just a few years ago, a review article looked at these studies. They basically looked at 14 studies that examined this, exactly how I told you, between arsenic and the children, looked at their hair, blood, and urine. And there was 37 that looked at lead in this. And the thing was, when you looked at it, it was basically 50-50. It was about, out of the arsenic exposure, 53% showed a positive association, and of the lead, 51%. Okay, so that's not really very overwhelming. So how did this article, when you if you just read the abstract, it says that there was a positive, let's see, I'll read it. There is consistent evidence supporting a positive association between early life arsenic and ASD. And then they say inconsistent for lead, but consistent for arsenic, which didn't make any sense to me because when you looked at the studies, it looked like it was about 50-50. And so the answer to that is what they did is they did a meta-analysis, which means that they pulled out a meta-analysis is basically when you pull out certain studies and run the statistics on them, but not separately, as a group. And so when they did that, they came up with a positive association in some of the studies. I won't go into all the how they picked them and all of that. And there's a lot of problems with that. As I wrote in my article, the biggest problem is that there's many subjective judgments, like which ones to include in this meta-analysis is like totally subjective. So anyway, they did come up with a positive. So they used that to be the basis of their saying that autism is, well, we won't say, they didn't say caused a positive association, but that's all a lawyer needs. Once they had that, they got that and went running with it. And basically using that, and they, there's apparently big law. Now, again, I don't know, it hasn't been thrown out yet, but at this point there are lawsuits. And as far as I can tell, that's the only evidence they have, which is very, very weak. So
let's talk about the subjectivity in these numbers really quick. This is really interesting to me. And there's two things here. So the first is that the research that you're talking about, it seems at best inconclusive. And from reading your story, the impression I get is that it depends on what sort of statistical footwork you do. I'm not saying they're looking to try to get a specific result, but if you were trying to do that, you just carry the one and then you shift this column over here and then pretty soon you have the result you want. So that's the first thing that maybe we can talk about. But the other thing, and it's the reason I read the wrong headline, is because I wrote an article about that congressional report.
Right, I read that.
There were some funny things that I had forgotten about. So, for example, when they're testing this baby food for supposedly high levels of these heavy metals, they're comparing it to a piece of legislation that they're lobbying for, which would lower the amount of these metals that can show up in baby food. So this isn't an established scientific standard they're using. They're saying, based on this level that we think is super protective of children's health, the baby food you're buying is potentially risky. So not only is that subjective, but I think it's also highly misleading because the implication is the FDA isn't doing enough to protect your kids. Excuse me. And then you bring these lawsuits into the mix, and then people start going, oh my gosh, is my baby going to get autism from baby food? It's so absurd. So I want to get both of you. What are your thoughts on these?
Well, I think you're actually spot on talking about things that way. It would be nice to put the horse in front of the cart rather than the other way around. And I think that what Susan is getting to when you get into the substance of her article is that this subjectivity plays in any of a number of ways, especially the thought that one single study, which doesn't have to necessarily have the largest number of patients in it, can be treated as the most dominant and shift the results of the meta-analysis. So I think that that's certainly problematic. On a slightly different note, I would say that one of the things that really drives this discussion about autism is something that Susan mentioned earlier, which is the tremendous stress, anxiety, and guilt on the part of the parents who have a disabled child for whatever reason. And you look for a place to not to put the blame so much, but to be able to explain it. And to simply say that it's random or that it's the luck of genes, something like that, is a very tough position to maintain. So it is far better to be able to say it's due to this or it's due to that. I mean, remember, if you go back on the history of autism, it used to be the reason for this was because of a cold mother that was, maternally distant. That was the cause of the problem. And over time, we've latched upon any number of different things. But the reason we latch upon these things, I think, is really driven a lot by the guilt and unhappiness on the parents of raising a child with disability, projecting how that child's life is going to go.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, all the science in the world here, when people want to find something, they latch onto it. And here's something, even though, there's a lot of issues with this. Number one, Cameron, what you said, I didn't really talk about, there was a lot wrong with these reports, what they came up with, what they considered high levels. I went into a little bit, but most people aren't aware that arsenic is present in every food, everything we eat. It's in a fairly non-toxic form usually in food, but seafood, rice, it's there. The fact that it's found in baby, it would be surprising if it wasn't found in baby foods because it's everywhere. And so, and that's why, they don't regulate baby food separately because they're regulating other foods. But anyway, but as soon as they hear it, they've got like, oh my gosh, again, I won't get into that whole dose makes the poison, but just to give one thing, if you looked at it kind of rationally, okay, remember my children, how long did they eat baby food for? Well, not, I don't remember, but it's in the months. When you think about I'm sure if I did the math as to how much was in there and how long they ate the baby food for, how much arsenic or lead they got, even in the worst case scenario, you would get nowhere near anything that could be harmful. But that's not even, part of this discussion right now, but it is something you need to think about. But I think it more goes to the emotional thing. If you argued, oh, well, your children didn't eat baby food long enough to be harmed, that doesn't seem like a good argument. The other one was that I think took some people by surprise was the fact that it was found, some of the highest levels were found in, quote, organic baby foods or whatever, because people have the perception, as you've tried to dispel, that organic means no chemicals, okay, even natural ones. And so the fact that they were finding them in all these, which of course we know why, because it's found in the ground and it's found in everywhere, but they were finding it at the same levels or higher in some of these. And when you read some of the articles from some of the mothers, they would say, well, I'm just going to go make my own baby food, which of course is very laughable because you'll get the same levels. The arsenic is not coming from what's being added. at the plant. It's coming from the food. So using your own apples or whatever, but you're not going to measure it, so you might feel better. But that's one of the solutions that's often, bandied about. So it's an interesting topic, but the science behind it but again, it's a hard one to argue with not because of the science. The science is easy. The hard thing is the emotional thing, because people, want to find a solution.
That's the toughest part. And it's especially, Chuck and I were talking about this on the last episode, because I'm a relatively new dad and he's been a dad for decades. And we were talking about how even when you know the facts of a situation, when it's your kid's health that's on the line, there's just something in you that's like, yeah, but just to be sure, it's like, I don't know, it's like your lizard brain is overpowering your ability to reason, so it is a challenge. I guess one of the only things we can really do is try to keep ourselves grounded and just look at the information we have in front of us. And so a couple of things that I did is I was going through this for my own interests, like, okay, what am I going to feed my son? And then I'm also looking at this as a science writer and someone who doesn't want to be bamboozled. And so you point out in the story that the FDA, they don't have legally enforceable limits that they set. They do set, I believe it's called an interim reference level, where they say, this is where we set food, and then the industry can use it and say, well, if it's below this, it's reasonably safe. And what I found out is that limit, it's a little under 10 times less than the amount of, say, lead that a child would have to be exposed to do harm. And that's a standard that's set by the CDC. So no one is told this information when these scare campaigns are launched or when these lawsuits are filed. It's that these regulatory agencies, for all their flaws, and they have very many, they don't want people to get sick on their watch, because that doesn't make you look good if you're a regulator,
At all.
So they have very conservative standards in place. And then these people, these activist groups and lawyers, they come on top of that and they go, yeah, but it needs to be like even super more conservative than that. So do you have any thoughts on how that information is disseminated to people? Either of you?
Well, people want to believe that nowadays, like, that the FDA, all these government agencies are evil, which I get, but they want to say, okay, the FDA is not, if not evil, at least they're not doing anything to protect us. And of course, there's a lot of problems, but the FDA in the whole, I have to say, they've done a pretty good job on the food side. I won't get into the drug side. And they've been pretty successful when you think about it with foodborne illness and a lot of these things. And when you're dealing with these levels, like I said, they get ridiculous because people want the FDA to do is to keep setting them lower and lower, and then you get lower than what's naturally found in the, you get to the level where it's ridiculous, because you're going to get more, from eating an apple than you would when you put this level in baby food. So I don't know. I don't have any real solution for it, because I think when the FDA has come out with things explaining their position on it.
There's another part to this, and there's a failure to communicate on both sides of the issue. The regulatory agencies, in this case, the FDA, rarely puts this information into a context that's understandable to the general public. And on the other side, the general public has not been well educated in high school in terms of understanding science, science writ large, science with a capital S. It's not, much of the high school education is learning a set of facts that can be given back on a test, rather than learning things like the scientific method and the fact that there's uncertainty and these larger issues, which would help frame a lot of public health policy today and make it understandable on both sides of that communication equation.
Yeah, it's an ongoing concern. They just seem to kind of suck at translating technical information into, a straightforward, here's what you need to know so you can buy baby food without,
Now, they'll tell you, if you read the communication manuals, the 10th grade level reading is too high for what they're trying to get out. I mean, that alone is scary.
Right.
And it's very difficult, I think, even at the 10th grade level, to explain certain scientific concepts. So if we're shooting for 6th or 7th grade, it's a tough haul.
And I don't mean to be too disparaging to most people, because I remember when I was writing about this, I'm looking up these 35-year-old studies, because the FDA does what's called the total diet study. It's this ongoing survey that they do of potentially toxic substances in the food that everybody eats. So they've been doing this for decades. So, I'm going back into these databases, looking at these PDF, photocopied studies, and I'm looking at press releases from 10 years ago. Like, I'm not surprised that people would have a difficult time doing that, because they have jobs and they've got lives to live. I understand. So I guess that is incumbent upon us to kind of get this information out. Okay. All right. Well, let's go on and talk about something that's a little more amusing, at least, which would be the health benefits of swearing. And I just love this headline, Chuck. The health benefits of swearing? What the and it's just very nicely done. So introduce this for us. What's going on here?
Well, I have a potty mouth. It just comes out. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I lived for so long in New York. And so when I was running across the list of scientific articles coming out, this one just jumped out at me. I said, oh, gee, if there's a health benefit to swearing, I really need to find out what that is so that I can, I've been claiming all along that the reason I do it is because I have Tourette's. It's not my fault.
This is better, though. It's healthy to swear.
This is part of my well-being program. So that's what caught me with the article, is just that. And it comes down to what we would all understand to be the case, is that swearing has a special ability to allow you to convey your feelings on all possible channels at once and get it out of your system.
I'm sorry.
My wife will often point out that sometimes I don't read the room well, and my comments are a little bit off for the group that I'm talking to at any given moment. But with swearing, it really doesn't matter, because at that point, everybody knows that it's kind of that explosive moment. And from the point of view of your body, it's a variation on the fight or flight scenario. You get a little release of some epinephrine. You get a heightened autonomic response. Your heart rate picks up. You become very attentive to things when you're in the midst of swearing. So those are all the positive qualities, at least from a physiologic point of view, to it. I did find it actually pretty interesting when they had done some studies to show that repetitive swear words were able to heighten your stamina and strength. And so maybe in the tennis matches, instead of having those noises after every volley, we could have the use of some of these colorful words just to change things up. So that was where we went with this. It was kind of a fun piece to write about. And go ahead.
There's something so interesting in here. So you write, studies have found that the primary motivation for swearing in some is to express and thereby release negative emotions and energies. And then you mention that this is a sort of a catharsis. It's almost like a reset button where, like, you're getting overwhelmed and you go, blankety blank. And yeah. And that really hit home with me. I'm trying to be a good Christian these days, Chuck, and not swear around my son and all that. But when he puts I don't know, something on like a marble or something in his mouth, there's no better word for what could happen in that moment than the F word. You know, it's unbearable. So that really struck home with me. You know, the research that they're doing seems to resonate with, you know, our anecdotal experiences. Is that what you find as well?
Yes, I think that they were spot on in terms of describing our behavior. And as it turns out, you know, I in passing, I mentioned the fact that all the languages have swear words, and all of them involve what they describe as fricatives. Whoever knew this word, which is just a way that the word is formed in our mouth. And I just saw an article the other day that most of the swear words also use those same kind of harsh sounds. That's what I mean by saying you're communicating on all channels. Not only are you screaming, not only does your face engorge itself with blood and you have that raging look, but the actual, there's an actual harshness to the sounds of the words that you're using that demand attention, even for a small moment. And then I can go back to my Zen state and continue on.
Continue with your meditation. So one thing I've heard over the years, and again, this may be just totally made up, but maybe not, is that when you're getting angry, when you can feel, right, to use a scientific term, when you're feeling like you're starting to boil over, the proper response is to develop a certain level of self-control and recognize that that's the wrong thing to do, right? So
yes.
So it's that sort of practice over time where you learn to control your temper, control your emotions, and then you reach sort of a more well-adjusted state, if you will. But does this research contradict that? Because it seems to be that, maybe if you hit a certain point, you need to hit the eject button in the form of...
Well, and I think that that's what it is. I think that, vis-a-vis the old marshmallow experiments with willpower, you're supposed to show some willpower for a set amount of time. And at that point, when willpower is no longer sufficient, the best thing to do is to go into the next room, put a pillow over your face, and scream until you feel better, which should only take a few seconds. And then you can return and go on. I found over time that was a simpler thing to do than just continue to be raging in the room I was in, because it was never going to work out to be in my favor if that was the case. And I guess as I got older and wiser, or perhaps more tired, I found that I could do that swearing internally. Usually I would begin by saying, "Please stop helping me. Everybody be quiet." And then I would have a few moments of internal swearing before I went on. And that seemed, in the cases where I was most stressed, which was in the operating room, to be the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what that's like. You're like, oh, crap, I nicked the wrong...
No, I mean, we'd not be nicking the wrong thing. No.
I know. I'm putting myself in that place.
Yeah. Now, it's funny because, when every once in a while in the office, my office staff was away and my wife would come in to fill in, and God bless her, I love her, but she was not as facile as the office staff. And so I would become a little unhappy, and I would raise my voice. But because she is my wife, her approach was just to reach into her purse and pull out her car keys and say, "I'm going home." And amazingly enough, it stopped right then and there.
Oh, that is so perfect, man. It seems that maybe it's like channeling it into productive activities. So there's days where I'm stressed after work and I go to the gym and I put in the angriest, heaviest heavy metal that I can find on Spotify, and I just dig into what free weights or running on the treadmill, and it works. It alleviates that stress. So and obviously there's more going on when you're exercising. But that I can't help but feel that it's like you're releasing that anger. You're going through that catharsis. That has to be part of it. So this all seems to make sense, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Right. My meditative brothers would say you're just releasing that negative energy.
Yeah.
Get thee behind me.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm going to do some squats and the devil's going to get behind me. This just occurred to me. This is waking up all sorts of thoughts in my head, but I've heard sociology. No, I think it's in psychology, but there's researchers that study what happens to your brain when you listen to music, particularly if you're in a live setting. So like you're at a loud concert, and even if the music is aggressive, people don't get violent, but they get happy and they get pleasure out of that. And one of the things they found is that it's sort of like a controlled sort of violence where like, you're not going to be harmed, but it's the same sort of release. You're like, I'm here with lots of other people. I can hear the drums, kicking me in the gut, and that makes you feel better. I just find all of this really, really, really interesting.
Music definitely entrains the people around it to be in the same kind of, I'm going to call it vibratory state, but the rest of you people with MDs, calm down. But, we lock into that bass that gives us the rhythm of what's going on, and we all begin to respond in the same way at the same time. And I think that that's a lot of what certainly happens with music, but you can see how you can alter your physiologic response and project various kinds of positive or negative energies.
Fascinating stuff. Well, maybe we have to develop a little more of a nuanced understanding of swearing. Maybe when you were young, mom didn't have it all correct. Maybe there's certain times where maybe.
I just wanted to throw in this one quote because it was one of my favorite quotes from George Carlin talking about, I guess it would be an earlier day of road rage. And he said, have you ever noticed that the people driving the car in front of you are morons, but the people that come from behind at 100 miles an hour and pass you by are idiots? And I think that in some ways captures the spirit of the benefits of swearing.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, you segment the type of nincompoop you're surrounded by. I like it. All right. Well, that's going to do us for today. I hope you all have gotten something out of this episode because I sure as hell have. All right. Well, if you want to get these stories that we talked about on the show, you just go to our website. It's acsh.org. Click on the subscribe tab up top, punch in your email address. We'll send you these stories 3 times a week. The ones that you read the most are the ones we talk about. So if you show up and you've read the stories, you go, hey, that's the article about swearing. I read that, and you get a little bit more out of it. But that's going to do it for today. Episode 30. I'm very excited, Chuck. We're rolling along here. And we will see everybody next week for episode 31.